I'm Dr. Adriel Trott, and this is a series on Plato's Republic. This is the second lecture. And we'll start by looking at the very first line of the dialogue. So at the very beginning, Socrates, and here Socrates is speaking in the first person, so we get Socrates narrating the story himself and telling us what happened. And he begins by saying, I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, son of Ariston, to pray to the goddess. So the first line, a couple things to think about here. The first line of the dialogue references the son of the good, the son of Ariston. Ariston means good in Greek. This suggests that, well, Glaucon is the son of the good, associated with what Plato is going to be thinking about in this dialogue, where he talks about the sun itself as an image of the good, the sun in the sky, not the sun that is the child of the father. But we start off having this sense that what we're talking about here in some way is about the good, and that this is Socrates' concern in the dialogue. So as I mentioned in the last lecture, Glaucon was the brother of Plato, and he was a hugely ambitious young man. He made efforts to show up as ambitious and as seeking after power way before it was the proper thing for an Athenian boy to do. He also becomes associated with the 30 Tyrants, which was the Spartan puppet regime that was installed in Athens when the Athenians lose the Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE. The 30 tyrants then are overthrown. There's a general effort to drive out those who are associated with the tyrants. Glaucon would be one of them, or at least possibly rumored to be. So this raises some questions about why Plato and Socrates are associating with tyrants, and whether philosophy is tyrannical or if it's possibly a guard against the tyranny of ambitious souls. Whether souls capable of doing great things should do great things seeking political power or economic power, or if they should actually seek what is great in itself. So Glaucon is one of the best of Athens. Socrates likes to spend time with those who are the best, those who are considered the good and the bright and the beautiful of Athens. The problem is that while Glaucon is ambitious, it seems that he's ambitious without some concern for what he will get, except for more. Harvard Shakespeare professor Stephen Greenblatt tells this great story that, returning to think about Plato's Republic, reminded me of, where he was in an event where they had watched, I don't know what could have happened here, but he was with Bill Clinton at a viewing of Shakespeare's Macbeth. And in the receiving line, just to interrupt for a minute and say, this is a photograph from when I was at the Piraeus. You can see that it's a shipping site. Here, let me see if I can move this around. In any case, yeah. So Greenblatt says, Mr. President, I said, sticking out my hand, don't you think that Macbeth is a great play about an immensely ambitious man who feels compelled to do things that he knows are politically and morally disastrous? And Clinton looked at him, still holding my hand, and said, I think Macbeth is a great play about someone whose immense ambition has an ethically inadequate object. I think that this is a way to think about Glaucon, that Glaucon has an ethically inadequate object. That is, the object of his ambitions is not adequate to his ambitions. It's not ethically adequate. What does that mean? Well, it's not, the extent of its goodness does not match the extent of its ambition. And so the ambition is beyond what is good, or it doesn't have something good that it can seek after. And I think that that's a way to think about what Socrates' concern with Glaucon is, that his ambition has an ethically inadequate object, or maybe it just has altogether an inadequate object, but certainly Socrates is interested in turning the son of the good to the good and not just to what he thinks is good for him. So in this first line, when Socrates says, I went down to the Piraeus with Glaucon, this sets up the whole Republic as Socrates' exit out of Hades. This is a familiar trope in Greek mythology, like Orpheus leading Eurydice out. Socrates is playing a song for those with whom he speaks to lead them out of the place of ethical inadequacy. Maybe it's leading them out of the cave, as the cave is the place that one has to be dragged out of. Perhaps this is a way to think about what he means when we start off with the sense that if he went down to the Piraeus, what he's doing is trying to get out, trying to move out. Socrates goes to the Piraeus, he says, to observe the festival of the goddess. And the goddess that he mentions there is Bendis. Bendis was a Thracian goddess who was associated with hunting. The Athenians associated her with Artemis. The Republic is going to go on to define justice in terms of minding one's own business or doing the task appropriate to one's nature, which raises some questions of what is our own and how can we determine what's most appropriate to us. So the Thracians are not Athenians, but they introduced Bendis to the Athenians. And this festival is worshiping her. So are the Athenians taking care of their own business when they worship Bendis? Or is that someone else's business? Socrates seems to accept that it's part of his business when he says that he goes down to pray to the goddess, but we can see this question in the background here. So this is a vase depicting Bendis approaching Apollo, who's seated. The celebration involved a torchlit race on horseback and then a solemn procession. So note that these festivities and their delights are replaced by the conversation of the Republic, which if we read out loud would take about 10 hours. So that's pretty much all night long. What we get is, instead of a festival to a god, we get a philosophical festival, perhaps to the good, to another way of thinking about the divine. In the several pages of action here in this first section, the question of how we get others to do what we think is best is raised. This is following the question of how you motivate those motivated to their own ambition to be motivated to the good. So the first approach to getting others to do what we want them to do, we can find in Glaucon. I'm sorry. We can find in the Polemarchus. So Socrates is walking out with Glaucon and he confronts Polemarchus, or Polemarchus's crew. So Polemarchus is a general. His name means many wars. He sends his slave to Socrates and Glaucon and orders them to wait. So Polemarchus demands that they do what he wants, or he will use force to accomplish his own way. Or he tells them that they could use force if they wanted to get their own way. So force becomes the mechanism that Polemarchus thinks dictates whether you can act how you want to act, or if you have to submit to what someone else wants of you. Socrates suggests an alternative. Socrates says, well, you could persuade us. In a dialogue then about forming a city together, Socrates begins with this effort to make their interaction political. This is going to be a place governed by action and speech rather than force and violence. Polemarchus draws attention to what is required for persuasion and thus for political life to be possible when he says, well, you'd need us to listen if you were going to persuade us. And Polemarchus refuses to be political by refusing to listen. Adeimantus, though, breaks this impasse by offering reasons. So in offering reasons, he concedes to the charge that they need to persuade them to do what they want to. And Adeimantus offers reasons that appeal to what they might desire, what Socrates might desire. Adeimantus says, well, there's going to be this festival on this torchlit horseback race that you can enjoy. So thinking about what Socrates wants tells us something about what persuasion involves, what it requires. That persuasion requires you to think about what somebody would want in order to get them to do what you think is best. It has to appeal in some sense to desires. And I say this because I think that this gives us a hint at what Socrates does with Glaucon, that he knows that Glaucon desires power, and so he's going to appeal to that desire in order to get Glaucon to take up the philosophical path. Adeimantus then proposes that they stay, and Socrates admits that he hasn't seen the horseback race, and Polemarchus then offers some reasons, so he engages in the persuasion. Here we seem to be performing and forming a little political community amongst ourselves. Socrates then says in language that invokes the formal language of the Athenian assembly when he says, well, if that's been resolved, that's how we must act. So this is the reference to that language that you might hear in a formal place. And he says that at 328b, I just want to note that I'm at some places going to refer to the page number, and when I do, I'll refer to the Stephanus page number so that whatever edition you have, you'll know where I'm referencing in the text. So they go to Polemarchus's house. There at Polemarchus's house, they find Lysias and Euthydemus. These are brothers of Polemarchus, and they are the sons of Cephalus, whose house they are at. Thrasymachus is there, Tremontites and Cleitophon, and Niceratus, I believe, also. Niceratus. Cephalus is an old man. His name means head. The line that introduces him and describes him says he's seated on a head chair, that he is crowned or headed with a wreath. The language keeps invoking the sense that Cephalus is all head. He's all in his head. And then he goes on to talk about how in his dotage, he doesn't worry about the desires anymore. So he seems to kind of moved away from the things of the body and to be completely in his head, close to death. Cephalus and his family were weapons makers, and through weapons making, they made a lot of money, but their money didn't buy them citizenship. They were medics, so they were like basically resident aliens. It was like they had green cards, but they couldn't buy their way into citizenship. And Cephalus says here that his age has allowed him to escape the desires of youth. And Socrates says, well, is it age really so much? Or is it that you've had so much wealth, this great substance that you have, that's really what's allowed you not to worry about the things that you had to worry about when you were young? And this leads Socrates to ask Cephalus whether he inherited or he earned what he now had. Then he asks, well, I want to know because it doesn't seem like you're concerned with money so much. And I wonder what you think you have most been able to benefit from by having money. What's the greatest good that you've had from having great wealth? And Cephalus responds that having money has allowed him not to be worried about the afterlife, where he might have to pay debts for what he's done on earth. So keep this in mind, because later the question about justice will be about whether it's better to get away with being unjust, not having to worry about paying one's debts in this life or another. So Cephalus introduces this way of thinking about justice as paying one's debts. And he says having money has allowed him to avoid injustice. But he does seem to understand this very much in terms of giving back what he owes. So what he owes to the gods, he's been able to give back the sacrifices, and what he owes to other human beings, whatever they do for him, he can do something in return. So now things get started. What justice is, the question of what justice is going to organize the rest of the dialogue. Cephalus assumes justice is a matter of a simple calculation, giving back what is owed, that we just need to figure out what we owe. But Socrates, as he often does, raises the question of whether it's always good to give back what is owed. So again, Socrates introduces whether this definition includes a sense of what's good, or if it just seems to give some kind of rule or direction without judgment of this kind. So if a person, he offers this example and he says if a person takes a weapon from a friend and the friend comes back and they're drunk or they're mad, it doesn't seem like it'd be a good idea to give them their weapons back at that particular moment. So Cephalus says, well, he says, well, I really got to go. Like, I'm just going to go sacrifice. And this interesting moment where he hands off the argument to Polemarchus in this way that he's inviting us to think about the second way that you might get someone to take on what you want them to do. And that is the patriarchal, or the sense that you might inherit something. You might inherit a view or a position. You might have to defend it because it is of your family. And here at 331D, Polemarchus says as much when he says, am I not the heir of what belongs to you? So he agrees to take over the argument because it is what he has inherited. And Cephalus says he's going to go take care of his approach to the afterlife by making the sacrifices. We never hear from Cephalus again. I think it's worth noting that we never hear from him again, that he seems to be sidelined. His concerns seem to be more about a world to come than this world. So one thing that you should be thinking about as you proceed is the level of attention that you give to the details. So I've just talked to you about 5 or 6 short Stephanus pages, but we've had a lot to say. So I encourage you to read the dialogue, paying attention to the details, thinking about the questions that come up, trying to chart the themes and issues and concerns. You can consider that as you go.